Hello, everyone. My name is Geisha Gonzalez. I am the Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you as we continue our #China Challenge campaign, a month-long series of events, articles, and analysis looking at China's various levers of influence: information, technology, economic, military, and political. This week, we will be focusing on China's tech and digital influence across Europe and North America. Featured in this discussion, you will see transatlantic experts doing a deep dive on what it means to have China's influence in technology, critical infrastructure, and cyber. I would like to take this moment to thank NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for their support of this event. Follow us using #China Challenge and sign up for our China Influence Monitor newsletter, a newsletter led by Senior Fellow Edward Lucas in partnership with Coda's Story. And now, Edward Lucas, who will chair this week's discussion.
Hello, and welcome to this CEPA discussion on Chinese digital influence. I'm Edward Lucas. I'm a non-resident fellow at CEPA based in London, England, and I'm joined by four panelists to discuss the ins and outs of this. They are Konstantinas Andrijauskas, who's Associate Professor of Asian Studies and International Politics at Vilnius University in Lithuania. There's Alicja Bachulska, who is China Analyst at the Asia Research Center at the War Studies University in Warsaw, which is a think tank affiliated with the Polish Ministry of Defense. Tim Rulik is from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and Naomi Wilson is Vice President for Policy Asia at the Information Technology Industry Council. Now, it's a huge subject, and we are going to try and drill down and say a few new and interesting things, as well as issue the warnings and other points which possibly have been said before. But I want to kick off just by asking each of our four panelists what they are working on right now to give us a bit of orientation. So I'm going to do alphabetical order in the way I introduce you. So Konstantinas, kick off with you. What's on your desk, and how are you trying to get rid of it?
So quite obviously, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event in such a distinguished auditorium. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor, and quite obviously addressing your question, probably the most pressing issue at this particular moment is to try and understand where is my country heading to in its general relationship with China. The listeners and the watchers might probably know that Lithuania happens to be a very peculiar case in point, because apparently the country is opting out from the 17 plus format, and there are several additional foreign policy initiatives related to China, which are rather curious, not only in terms of the regional context, but I would believe in the global context as well. So this is probably the most pressing issue that I'm currently working on, but in general, my interests, they also cover Chinese domestic politics, particularly the relationships between the central government and its minority and borderland areas, so to speak. And just to put it mildly, in effect, those two topics are somewhat interrelated, even in particular as far as Lithuania's foreign policy making is concerned, because the country attempts to be pretty active on all of the issues related to China's human rights situation, quite obviously, also touching upon the ethno-linguistic minorities of the country. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, and also for highlighting the way in which Lithuania has become the kind of tip of the spear of efforts in the region to deal with the 17+1, very prominently sending a transport minister to the 17+1 summit and offering to open or planning to open an office in Taiwan later this year. And this is, for those of us who remember geopolitics of 30 years ago, it's quite familiar seeing Lithuania standing up to countries much bigger in size, if not in determination. Super. Well, I'm going to go straight on to Alicja. Alicja, bring us up to date with what you're working on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be actually able to share my thoughts with you here today. So currently I'm working on a couple of issues. So I'm based in Poland. So I'm basically analyzing the recent developments within the 17+1 framework. As Konstantinas has already mentioned, we're witnessing a shift towards China in a couple of regional capitals, which is obviously of an interest for me. And I'm also working on a project monitoring local media narratives that are related to China in some crucial areas of cooperation. And there is a paper coming soon on the topic, but I cannot yet tell you exactly the topic of it, but stay tuned. It will be published in a couple of weeks, hopefully.
Super, Alicia. Well, thanks for that. And I should have said we run a weekly bulletin on Chinese influence called the China Influence Monitor. And do make sure to ping me in advance so I can highlight the your new paper
Sure.
in that and share it with all our readers. Over to you, Tim, in Stockholm. What are you working on? Sweden is also absolutely in the front line of Chinese influence operations with everything from the jailed bookseller Gui Minhai through to worries about Huawei and possibly the most aggressive Chinese embassy anywhere in Europe, I suspect. Fine wines for our friends and shotguns for our enemies. What's on your desk?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for the invite, and also very glad to hear that people outside of Sweden notice what's happening here in the bilateral relations. That is really a deep concern to me and to many of my colleagues. We have published a paper on Swedish public opinion last year that reflects very much how the Swedish public is perceiving that, and you can see a major shift. So the behavior of the ambassador here in Sweden has actually a major impact. I think both policy-wise on policymakers, but also on the general public. On broader terms, what I'm working on a lot related actually to today's topic here in this discussion, Chinese influence through digital technologies. I think why I've been invited is because I have a project on China's technical standardization policy and how that translates into international influence. And I'd be very happy to elaborate a bit on that later on. We've also been working in particular on the 5G issue and Huawei, not just what's happening here in Sweden, but also with regards how the actual structure, how Huawei is controlled and where the loopholes are for the Chinese Communist Party in the firm structure of Huawei itself. I have a new project on Chinese and European approaches to smart seaports that may sound a bit unrelated, but the idea behind that project is essentially that 90% of international trade is maritime, so it's running through harbors, it's running through ports, and the more digitalized those harbors get, the question emerges, well, who has actually access to international trade data that is collected in those harbors? And then finally, I'm still also, like Konstantinas, looking a bit into the domestic angles and how they influence Chinese international affairs. So my background is also a bit in China's political economy and how that translates into foreign policy making. And I have a forthcoming book on that subject later this year as well.
So thanks very much indeed for that Tim, and highlighting the very important element of the data generated from logistics and infrastructure, which the Chinese take very seriously and we often overlook, and also this vital business of standard setting, these sort of boring but important international agencies and organizations where the Chinese have a very coordinated attitude to getting what they want, and they send their best people there, and we perhaps don't give quite so much attention to it. So now finally in our first round, Naomi, greetings to you from I guess it's morning in America. It's afternoon here. Tell us what you're working on, and then after that we'll get into some more specific discussions.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I really look forward to hearing my colleagues' perspectives and analysis. As you might expect, I get asked all too often about US-China, bilateral relations. And so it's refreshing for me to be able to participate in a venue that is not solely focused on those two countries. And so for my part, I work for ITI, which is a tech trade association, and we represent approximately 80 global technology and tech-enabled companies that are headquartered all over the world. And it's my job to help our companies understand the policy landscape in the US, in Asia, and how it affects their trade policies, cybersecurity, regulatory compliance work. And of course, one of the major issues is China and what's going on not only in the Chinese market, but in other markets in terms of imitation of China and postures towards China, confrontational or otherwise. I also lead our standardization policy working group, which is comprised of our company's technical standards experts. So I'm glad to see that we're going to touch on that topic today as well. And I look forward to the conversation.
Well, that's great. That's given us a lot to kick off on. I mean, I can see several things here. I think we'll want to have a good thorough look at the standardization question, and I might come back to Tim in a moment on that, and we'll look at where we're kind of winning and where we're losing. There's also the sort of the headline issue of 5G and Huawei, because that's the thing that's really caught the public's attention, this idea that Huawei is somehow dodgy and that 5G is really important and we need 5G, but we don't want Huawei. So that's where these technical issues get over into public opinion. So I think perhaps we'll start on that and then get into the sort of broader standardization thing later on. So let's go to Alicja first. Where are we on 5G and Huawei in Poland? Because I've got the impression that there's a bit of a wobble in Poland towards China, very friendly phone calls between President Duda and Xi Jinping with radically different readouts from the Chinese and Polish side, and Poland thinking about possibly Chinese vaccine and so on. So what's happening both on the bilateral side with 5G and Huawei in Poland, and also any perspectives you've got on the region?
Sure, thank you, Edward. So I will start by quickly summarizing what has happened with Huawei throughout the last 2 years, because the whole debate on the role of Huawei in Poland has actually started in early January 2019, when Huawei made the headlines when the Chinese national and also a Huawei employee in Warsaw was arrested on spying allegations here in Poland, together with a Polish national who simultaneously was an ex-security services officer. And both men are now officially indicted on espionage charges, and they are awaiting a trial. So the issue is actually not really widely debated because it's been already 2 years since the arrest took place. But let's remember that back then in early 2019, the timing was quite telling, as it happened 1 month after Meng Wanzhou, Huawei CFO and the daughter of the company's founder, was arrested in Canada over possible violations of international sanctions against Iran. So the two arrests, and especially the second one, which happened on the Polish soil, it initiated the local debate on the security implications of 5G rollout, and also on the involvement of Chinese companies in the process. So what followed was an incremental policy change, both at domestic and international levels. So at domestic level, we have witnessed new legal instruments being developed, most importantly, an amendment of the existing Poland cybersecurity law. Its first draft was published in September last year, and it included quite a number of provisions that could potentially lead to Huawei's exclusion from the Polish market. For example, because of an introduction of an assessment process with special scrutiny towards non-EU vendors coming from authoritarian regimes. But since September, the draft went through a series of consultations and changes, and the current version was published in late January this year. And it seems a little less strict. For example, it doesn't contain provisions on human rights, because the previous version actually did contain some human rights-based assessment when it comes to the providers and their countries of origin. But the precise shape of this amendment has not been set yet, so we're still awaiting the final version. But for all we know, its final form will be in line with the EU 5G toolbox, which probably means that we're going to see more diversification, and we will probably not see a complete Huawei ban that will actually name Huawei as such, but again, more diversification and more focus on European providers and these moves towards achieving EU technological autonomy.
Super.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for that. And I would recommend people to read your excellent article called Trojan Horses, Jilted Suitors, which was about, it's from a couple of years ago, but it was a very, very good roundup of the Polish-Chinese relationship and also that very exciting spy bust. Let's go to slightly to the northeast, to Lithuania and Konstantinas. Tell us where we are on 5G and Huawei in Lithuania, and give us any further perspectives, if you like, on where the Lithuanian-Chinese relationship is heading, or perhaps not heading.
So quite obviously, Poland happens to be a very important economic and security partner for the country. It is dictated by many factors, including geography, because Poland happens to be the only terrestrial connecting point to the rest of the European Union and the NATO. I mean, the core, quite obviously, we do have common border with Latvia and other Baltic states. So what happens in Poland is of tremendous importance for us. So the events that Alicja mentioned, particularly those related to the beginning of 2019, they quite obviously made an impact in Lithuania. Until several months later, our intelligence services, they named for the first time officially China as a threat to the country's national security, and it has become a trend ever since. So one of the big questions in this regard was quite obviously how to deal with the question of 5G rollout in the country. And Lithuania was a little bit pending in this regard in comparison to our two fellow Baltic sisters of Estonia and Latvia, but finally the representatives of the government signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States, with Mike Pompeo at that time, the Secretary of State, in the beginning of autumn or fall last year. So basically the Lithuanian government at this particular moment is rather clear on this point that the Huawei and other similar companies of Chinese or say Russian origin, if that ever happens, that they would not be allowed to participate in the rollout of the 5G network in the country. And we have already witnessed some clear-cut developments in this regard on the commercial side when Telia Lietuva, the largest telecommunications company in the country, which is also of Swedish origin, it basically decided to switch entirely to the Nokia and Ericsson-based infrastructure in the country, citing the memorandum of understanding and citing the sheer fact that the same company happens to be a part and parcel of our legal framework. So basically, the company is included into the law that basically attempts to protect the country's critical infrastructure infrastructure. So Lithuania in general has one of the strictest foreign investment screening mechanisms, which was originally designed to counteract Russia's advances in this sphere, but currently China is also being viewed as a potential nuisance and maybe even as a threat in this regard. So basically, we are rather clear-cut on this particular point when it comes to 5G, and actually the trends related to the worsening relationship with China, they're reaching way beyond. They're reaching to other high-tech sectors, but I'm not sure whether I should be talking about these right about now. So that has a lot to do with fintech, commerce, even. So there is this general backlash against the Chinese high-tech at this particular moment.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned fintech. We may want to get into that a bit later on, because it's another area in which I feel the Chinese forethought has left some Western decision makers a little bit scrambling to catch up. But let's go across the Baltic Sea to you, Tim, because there's a very odd thing about Huawei in Sweden is that you have one of the main Western competitors is Ericsson, who should stand to benefit if we switch away from Huawei to another provider. But rather oddly, Ericsson's been lobbying on behalf of Huawei, perhaps not with total sincerity, I sometimes think, but at least a sort of performative support for Huawei, perhaps in hopes of preserving their business in China. And there's also been a quite complicated legal battle going on. So fill us in on the Swedish perspective, and also add anything else from the rest of the Nordic region, if you'd like.
My pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, being familiar with the details of Swedish law, so I'll largely skip that and just report that yes, we are indeed in middle of several proceedings that look into several aspects. One, whether the ban itself has sort of been legal. Another, sort of what needs to be done or can or cannot be done during the time of the legal proceedings on the main subject, etc. So there's several issues going on simultaneously. But I mean, the starting point of this is obviously that Sweden has decided, as the only EU member state now that the UK unfortunately has left the Union, that Sweden is the only one that has issued an outright ban of Huawei to the 5G networks. Now, what is quite interesting is, I think, is sort of the domestic game that has been developed around that. One aspect is that has been issued by PTS, the agency for postal and telecommunications, but that agency is certainly sort of not the source of that decision, but it refers back to a law that has been adopted in late 2019, where the government empowered essentially the armed forces of Sweden and the intelligence community to issue a veto in case national security was endangered, and the parliament hasn't given really any specifications what accounts as a threat to national security. And surprise, surprise, the security agencies took the liberty they were given, and they issued exactly that warning. So PTS essentially reacted to what has happened in those agencies. Interestingly, though, the following day, the Prime Minister of Sweden was, of course, had to answer some questions there. And he said, which is absolutely not in line with what his own agency had said, that ban wasn't naming or addressing any specific company. So what you can see here is that there are already frictions between the government and governmental agencies in Sweden. That said, I mean, the government hasn't done anything to sort of withdraw again the decision that PT has announced. Instead, it's defending that in Swedish courts. And then, of course, the second, maybe even more interesting round came across that, as you mentioned, Ericsson started to lobby in favor of Huawei. And I think that, I mean, if you had been talking to Ericsson in the months and years ahead, Ericsson was never in favor of a ban of Huawei. you're right that Ericsson may profit sort of in a few European states from that, but Ericsson is deeply intertwined with China. And on two fronts. One is indeed what is being reported all the time, that Ericsson is relying on the Chinese market to sell its own products to China. I would even add to that, it's not just a certain market share, but we also need to take into consideration that China is quite ahead in a certain form of the 5G, which is called the standalone 5G, which is much more, which makes use of much more use cases and is much more innovative, while the Europeans are mainly kind of updating the 4G networks to what is called non-standalone 5G. So it's not just the market share in itself, but that the Chinese market is a particularly innovative and interesting one for Ericsson, and being shut out of that, I think, is one concern. But you also need to remember a second concern, I think, for Ericsson, and that is that Ericsson is producing in China, and it has lots of Chinese suppliers. And I mean, there is interdependence between both sides, I would say, and I don't really see the Chinese cutting Ericsson off their supply chain. But if you are a CEO of Ericsson, and if you sort of look into the developments of the last few years, that the whole discussion of decoupling emerged, and all these issues, stuff that we wouldn't have envisioned 5 years ago or 10 years ago, then of course I think it is maybe quite forward-looking and trying to really calculate the risks here and see, while we actually depend on Chinese supply chains, so it might make sense here to indeed lobby for China. So I think that Ericsson indeed has no interest in Sweden's ban. And let me finish with one maybe last sentence. I'm not sure that Sweden's decision has been particularly wise if we just think of how to play those issues. Just look at Italy, what they do, and compare it with Sweden. In Italy, you have an agency that has simply increased the bureaucracy for operators, for Italian operators that use non-European equipment, and so they demand lots of documentation on a very regular basis, some of it on a weekly basis. And the rationale is, I think, very clear. It is to make the use of ZTE and Huawei equipment unprofitable, and that way, I think, is a quite clever one. And the Chinese apparently have reacted to this in a quite different and much more calmer way. I mean, they have never sort of threatened the country what the Chinese have done with Sweden. So I think this very open and explicit ban of Huawei from Sweden is something that is quite disturbing for a number of actors in Sweden. It may have not been sort of the wisest way to play it, even though you could say, well, one must open the mouth and say out loud what he or she thinks, and not just play bureaucracy here. But in terms of sort of policy making, I think there would be other means that make less noise with the exact same effect.
Good. Well, that's a good point to jump off to you, Naomi, going across the Atlantic with your, I imagine American tech companies wouldn't be absolutely thrilled at the thought of having Italian-style bureaucracy applied on all non-EU providers of technology. It might be better if we said it was non-NATO or something like that. But give us your take on where we are on Huawei. I should have said that you used to be at DHS before you were in your current job, so you've got a background in national security issues. Go ahead.
Sure. So I think when we're looking at the broader landscape of cybersecurity and supply chain security, which have been become increasingly intertwined, it's important not to focus on just one either country or entity, but to look at the full picture, because the supply chain is intertwined and it is complex. And I think that's come to light, and policymakers have had to come to that realization especially from the US perspective, as the US government has tried several different policies to enhance security of supply chains and to decouple with varying degrees of success. And what's become very clear is that there are unintended consequences of making drastic changes to supply chain security and policy, especially without consulting with industry, which has been one of the difficulties on the U.S. side. A lot of the expertise on cybersecurity and supply chain resides in the private sector in the U.S. And contrary to popular belief, the U.S. government is not typically on private sector networks, so they don't see what the private sector sees. They have one part of the picture, which is absolutely an essential and important piece of the picture from an intelligence community perspective and from general expertise about what's going on in terms of influence and espionage. But then you have the private sector who sees exactly what's going on their networks, who sees the intrusions or attempts to intrude. And so it's really important that both sides compare notes, not only in terms of getting the lay of the land and the full picture, but also in terms of determining what the most appropriate policies are to address the problem. And that's where we've seen some unintended consequences over the past few years. I think now the US government is finding its footing a little bit more, but there's still a bit of a rush to judgment, I think, on the policy side. And from the US government, what we worry about in industry is that there's not a lot of coordination going on across the government. In particular, Congress kind of does its own thing, and they have a number of well-meaning but very clearly targeted towards China bills, and then you have the interagency that drives the policy process and the regulatory process. And all of these can have knock-on effects that can undermine innovation, can cut off resources to funding research and development, which is really like our first line defense in terms of increasing our technological advantage and developing those next generation technologies that are going to keep US and multinational technology companies leading and out in front. So in short, it's a very complicated landscape, and we need the private sector and the public sector to be working together to get the full picture.
Well, it's coming across very clearly that it's complicated enough at a national level of reconciling the national security and geopolitical interests of the country with the specific commercial interests of the companies. And of course, that gets even more complicated once we get onto international standard setting. And I think we better spend a few minutes on that first, because we're rapidly running out of time, and we could go on for hours on this. It's so interesting. But who'd like to jump in first on what are we getting wrong on the standard setting, and what's giving China the advantage? Who wants to jump in on this? Just yes, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. If you allow, just one sentence that I want to say on the Huawei, and then I'm jumping right into the standards. I think what really is necessary here on Huawei is to sort of make sure we keep in mind there. I think there's two logics. One is sort of really the network security in itself. So and there we are looking for a smoking gun, etc., etc. So there's a really technical component to what China can do, and it's related to sabotage, and it's related to espionage concerns. That is one, and that is the question how to address that. These are real concerns. I personally have never been convinced that a ban of Huawei is really effectively addressing that issue. And a second one, and that is, I think, where I also hear that we need to coordinate much better across the Atlantic, and where really this country by country approach does not help, is the question of technological dependencies. And that's sort of the geo-economic and geopolitical angle of it, and technological dependencies we run into. And that, I think, is really something where we need across transatlantic cooperation and transatlantic agreement on. Into the standardization issue, well, I think that technical standardization, if you ask what we get wrong about it, I mean, first of all, we have to state very clearly that Western actors are still the strongest in international technical standardization. This applies to formal institutions as well to de facto standardization. So, I mean, we haven't done everything wrong, but I mean, we should not wait and see how China is massively increasing its influence internationally and not think about the implications. What I think makes it so hard for people to recognize the importance of technical standardization is that the logic behind standards is an inclusive and not an exclusive one. So we think of decoupling, we think in terms of the trade war, we think of sort of how some suppliers are cut off, or some actors are cut off or have worse access to it. And that is sort of not the basic logic behind standards. That's the basic logic behind patents, that you want to make technology exclusive. Standards, a good standard is one that is applied across the board, ideally globally. So in that regard, I think it is, at first, it's counterintuitive that standards would be an issue of that technological competition between the US and China, and where then to situate Europe in all this. But I think there's at least 4 dimensions, and I will be very brief on them, that show that technical standards do come with influence and power. One is an economic one. Yes, standards are seem in the logic to be the opposite of patents, but lots of standards consist of patents. We speak of standard essential patents, and companies hold those patents. They are required to license those under fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms. And that sounds very nice. That it sounds, I mean, the wording sounds as if they give it almost for free, but just realize that Ericsson's revenue, around 20% of Ericsson's revenue comes from such licensing fees. So
we need to hurry you up a bit, Tim, because we've got
a
few.
So that's enormously important in terms of our competitiveness. The second dimension is a legal one. Standards are voluntary on paper, but they are actually treated as technical barriers to trade under international trade law. So if you write international technical standards, you do de facto write international trade law. The third dimension is lock-in effects. Not all standards are global. So if you create areas in which certain technical standards apply, then those actors in those areas, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, actually need for the maintenance and further build out of that technology need to go back to suppliers with these specific technical standards. So they are locked into the technology of a specific country. And the fourth and final dimension is an ideational dimension. Technology is never value free. You can design a wireless network that prioritizes, for example, the privacy of someone, and you can prioritize the efficiency. So, and that was exactly what happened between the Wi-Fi standard from the West and the WAPI from China. And so it looks technical, but it also comes with an underlying ideational values dimension. And that's why I think it looks from the outside as being very technical and non-political, but in effect, it has several dimensions, how you can project political influence internationally if you set technical standards.
Super. Alicia, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I would just like to build upon what has been already said and highlight one more dimension. For example, it's been said that we have this tech component, but we also have the political and diplomatic component. And from my perspective, these two components are often so intertwined that when we look at the shape of the public debate, for example, in Poland on the standards and security of 5G, it's very hard to actually understand where are the division lines between the tech component and the perceived political component. For example, Poland endorsed the US Clean Network Program, which is supposed to be this complementary tool to achieving European strategic technological sovereignty. But on the one hand, it's obviously a clear sign that Poland wants to support Washington's effort towards building this kind of non-Chinese networks. But then on the other hand, if you look at the list of these so-called clean telecom companies in Poland, for example, Orange or T-Mobile, these are the networks that are so interconnected with Huawei when it comes to the previous generations of the telecommunication networks that we don't really know whether we're talking about standalone 5G or non-standalone 5G. What is the definition of this clean network that we want to support when cooperating with, for example, the US? So the whole debate is still very unclear, and that's, I think, a big problem.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Alicja. And I want to finish up just by looking at the question of data, which we sort of touched on, because one of the mistakes we make is to think, this is where China's building an airport, this is where China's building a telecoms network, this is Chinese fintech, and we look at the issues surrounding that particular project. But there's also the question of all the associated data that gets collected about people, passengers and freight going through the airport, about people who are using the payment platforms and so on. So it gives China tremendous insight into whole huge areas of our society and of our economy and our politics and everything else. And I want to try and finish up just getting a quick sense from all of you about how worried we should be about that. Is that a potential threat? Is it an acute threat right now? What are the countermeasures? How should we be dealing with it? So I'll go around the panel in reverse order, I think. And Naomi, do you want to kick us off, and then we'll go to the other panelists, and then I'll wind up.
Sure. So like most things that we're discussing today, it's complicated. I would put this in the category of potential threat. We don't yet know what value data will bring from a cumulative perspective. But what's clear is that the amassing of data and collecting of data in of itself doesn't yet provide an advantage. I think we need to place ourselves in the current time and the current technology. You can't filter unlike data through an algorithm and expect to get the recipe for world domination. And I think we risk oversimplifying to that degree in some of the policy calculations and some of the very black and white constructs of data is the new oil and whatnot. And it's important to understand foundationally, data is not oil. Data can be used again and again and again. It can be used at the same time by different parties. It has to be in like formats in order to make any sense. And data input, if it's poor, will lead to poor data output. So, we can't just assume that more data equals more power, better results. Certainly, data aggregation is an emerging issue, and certain sensitive data can lead to either an economic or an espionage-related advantage. But it's important not to look at it from a purely linear perspective.
Super. Thanks so much. Tim, Sweden has very tough laws on data, but China is very keen about collecting data inside Sweden. How do we reconcile that?
Well, I mean, I've been long before, so I'll be very brief this time. I think I can only agree with what Naomi said, but maybe with a different shade here. I do think that indeed, it's not just if you have a certain mass of data, you have a certain amount of influence. That I think that equation is indeed too simple. At the same time, I do think it is a necessary but not a sufficient precondition to developing digital influence or translate capacity in digital technologies into international power. And again, I mean, if I circle back here to standards, I think if we think in terms of key enabling technologies that relate to artificial intelligence, and if we think that technical standards are usually developed from early movers, maybe not first movers, what is very often said, but early movers, then of course it is very essential to have very good data that you can explore and that you can build for your innovation to actually set the standards of the future. And in that regard, I think it is, as Naomi said, it's not sufficient in itself. It's not just the amount of data. But in that regard, I think China, with its relatively lax data regulation, has an advantage that the West needs to respond somehow.
Alicia, over to you.
Thank you. I also agree with Naomi. I think that long-term implications of data collection for strategic reasons are still unknown. But if we want to look for some positive angle, I would say that technology and data collection is still human-led in a way. So there is still this human factor out there. On the one hand, it means that we can that there is a danger somehow out there that technology could be used for malign reasons. But then on the other hand, we also have the ability to reflect on the whole process. And it's not, to a certain extent, it is path dependent, but we still have some room to actually think about possible ways for both the European Union and the US and the rest of the world to actually balance China's advantages in this regard.
Thanks. And finally, Konstantinas, back to you. I had to skip over you last time, so do respond to any other of the points that were made as well as this question of data.
Well, I believe that an additional perspective has to be added in this regard. So quite obviously, if we would look at the developments within China itself, so the whole rhetoric about the social credit system or the systems is probably a little bit overblown at this particular moment, but there is definitely something going on and something very, very important potentially. And if we would look particularly at the situation in Xinjiang, which well, might be probably seen as a kind of a pilot project now there in that particular place of China, if you will. The implications of data collection, they are already being seen, right, very clearly as an attempt to police, as an attempt to actually control the region, its population, its behavior, and the repercussions of these possibilities are indeed tremendous. And if one would add the AI breakthroughs, if one would add other possible breakthroughs, then the situation might be even more dire in this regard. So the big question is probably about the export of this particular model in the mid to long term across the world, and I believe that would be one of the major issues that the Western governments would have to deal with.
Super. Well, on that note, I'm afraid our time is out. We could have continued for more than an hour, or indeed had a series of hour-long discussions, and we still wouldn't have got to the bottom of this. But thank you very much indeed for making the time. And to those of you who are watching, please do follow our panelists on Twitter. We have Naomi is at ITI_tech-tweets. Tim Rulig is at Rulig. Alicja Bachulska is at _Bachulska, and Konstantinas, I think you're not on Twitter, is that right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, and of course, CEPA's on Twitter. And do please also subscribe to the China Influence Monitor, which is our weekly pithy, snarky look at Chinese influence operations and their Western footprint. And we also have lots of CEPA research on China, including compare and contrast on Russian and Chinese activities on the infodemic and upcoming on influence operations in Eastern Europe. So from me, Edward Lucas in London, thanks very much indeed to our panelists, Naomi Wilson, Alicja Bachulska, Konstantinas Andrijauskas, and Tim Rulig, and look forward to seeing you at least electronically again on the internet very soon. Bye-bye.